cook, and the words that are about to come out of my mouth are going to feel a little strange. Up until this webinar, I would have said, and I'm the assistant director of the Center for Healthy Churches. But as of today, it still feels a little strange. I will say I'm the director of the Center for Healthy Churches. We have not done away with Bill Wilson. I'm glad that he is on with us today. I think coming to us from the mountains of North Carolina, if I understand correctly. He is still alive and well and part of our organization. But I was joking with one of my colleagues earlier this morning. I should have rented a throne by which to administer the webinar today. That's a little bit of inside politics for inside baseball for those of you who kind of know us organizationally, and matters not one whit. But I'm really excited about handing over the responsibility for the day to my colleague Jim Kitchens in just a moment, who's going to kind of take us through today's webinar and serve as our host. Before I do that, I want to thank all of the partners that helped make this webinar a reality. We are very grateful for the good work of New Matrix. Their co-principals Jim Kitchens and Deborah Wright are on with us this morning. We're grateful for the good work of the Church Network, which hosts all of the recordings of the previous recordings of this webinar. We're grateful for Truett Seminary and the Church Network, for the Gardner Webb Divinity School, for the Presbyterian Foundation, and for the Lake Institute of Faith and Giving, all church-facing organizations trying to resource congregations and ministers for this adaptive moment in the life of the church. And speaking of adaptive moments, that's what our focus is going to be on today. So let me turn over the hosting reins over to my friend and colleague, Jim Kitchens. Jim, take us away.
All right. Thank you, Matt. Well, when I was thinking about this series this month, I was reflecting on the conversations I've had with lots of folks about, sort of when is the new normal going to happen? And my typical response is in about 3 to 5 years. And so that we're in a time of real churn, of people trying things, but figuring out that doesn't work and trying again, sort of an iterative process of experimentation. And so what I wanted to do during the month of September, we're going to be talking with people who have said, I'm not waiting for a new normal to appear. I'm going to begin to try some stuff, and I'm willing to risk failure in order to figure out something new that might work in the context in which we're trying to do church right now. So that's what we're going to be talking about during the month of September. I'm really glad to have Graham Standish with us today. Graham is the executive director of the Samaritan Counseling, Guidance, and Consulting in Sewickley, Pennsylvania, and director of its Clergy and Congregations program, where he works with pastors one-on-one as a spiritual director and coach, leads pastor groups, offers workshops on healthy churches, and consults with congregations and judicatories. We were just talking about that over the last 25 years. He's been traveling around the United States and Canada, trying to help us figure out what's going on and how to be faithful and vital in this time in the church's history. For 22 years, he was the senior pastor of Calvin Presbyterian Church in Zelienople, Pennsylvania. Throughout his career, he's led churches and nonprofits through did I get even close, Graham?
You did. It was close. It's Zelienople, and you could tell by Michelle's laughter that.
Yeah, I know.
But you said Zelienople, which I like also.
Yeah. Well, Michelle often laughs at me, Graham. So that I couldn't tag it to that particular gaffe. He's the author of 10 books, articles on spirituality, spiritual direction, and spirituality in congregations, including his newest book, Preaching to Those Who Are Walking Away. And so our conversation with Graham today is going to be about his understanding of preaching and why most preaching isn't working anymore, and what we need to do to preach to people who are thinking about walking away from the church or maybe have one foot already out the door, which describes many of the people in our culture today. So as we begin this conversation, I'm going to invite you that if you hear something that Graham says that you want to ask more about, put your questions in the chat. And if we have time at the end of our webinar today, I'll give some of his questions your questions to Graham as we go. Maybe to get us started, Graham, I have to admit, I only took one preaching course in seminary, and that was humor in the pulpit. So really not much of a preaching 101 class. You talk about in your book that you didn't take a single one.
Well, I took one. I walked out of it and I stopped going.
Okay. So tell us why. Tell us why you made that choice, not to take any preaching courses in seminary.
So a large part of the book is about how do you reach people, especially who are considering themselves to be spiritual but not religious, which is a huge, we often call them the nuns and duns, but they're the people who really still have a spiritual yearning but have walked away from the church. That was me. I went through confirmation. I told my father that I didn't want to become a member of the church. And it wasn't because, I was a slacker or, that I just was bored with church. I actually had a really deep spiritual yearning, and I felt like the church wasn't addressing it. And so I stood up, as agreement with my father, I stood up before our session and said, I don't choose to join the church at this time. And so I walked away from the church for about 9 or 10 years, and really was dabbling in all sorts of spiritualities because the Protestant church really wasn't talking about spirituality. We have had a tendency to be theologically oriented. And I can tell you right now, I have yet to meet the first person who has said, I am theological but not religious, while I have met many, many, many who have said, I am spiritual but not religious. And yet we insist on thinking that everything is theological, which is intellectual up here, when people are really not asking the question, how do I think about things? They're asking the question, where is God? And how can I find God? And how can I follow God? And how can I get through this crisis? So to your question, I think the problem is we are not speaking to the yearnings of where people are. We are speaking about things that they're not that interested in. And we're not talking about the things that really grapple them. And I will say, I've been a Presbyterian pastor for 34 years, and there's a part of me that still considers myself to be spiritual but not religious. And so I've had a deep sensitivity to the people who've walked away. And the church I led for 22 years, we tripled in size while I was there. We doubled in attendance. And a large part of it was because we kept asking, how do we reach the people who are walking away? And we attracted a lot of them. So I think our ways of learning how to preach, I'm going to sum this up in a really short way. James Carville, back in the 1990s, when he was leading Bill Clinton's election campaign and re-election campaign, used to say, all politics are local. I kind of adapted that to preaching to say, all preaching is personal. When we do intellectual abstract sermons, they're not personal enough and people are asking personal questions. The preaching that gathers people are the ones that talk about the struggles of their lives, that engage them with story and guidance and sharing of experiences. And I think it's just what we have not been doing very well in the mainline church. And you can really see it. And we keep coming up with answers for how to get everybody back, and we keep declining faster. So that's a big answer to the question.
Well, yeah. So it really was that you're only taking that one course and walking out of it. Was that? I'm hearing you say that was kind of a moment that you realized that's not the answer.
Yeah, I don't want to be taught by these people who are preaching the same stuff. It didn't mean I wasn't doing anything about my preaching. I began to study people like John Bradshaw and Wayne Dwyer on PBS. I would watch the shows literally with notebooks in hand, but I would notice how they're speaking to people, how they're walking around, how they bring out their concepts. Even though I am not a non-denominational evangelical and find quite often their messages to be shallow. I studied a lot of evangelical preachers, and I walked and watched how they engaged people. That they didn't stand behind a pulpit looking down for the most part and reading their paper in public. They were out there speaking to people as though, the metaphor I give is as though they're sitting at dinner with people. Of course, sometimes they yell and shout, which isn't very appropriate in a restaurant. So I didn't follow that part.
Well, yeah. So you went outside of the church and looking
Yes.
at speakers that were engaging people. How wide did that note taking go? I mean, tell us a few more of the folks that you really found helpful for you as a preacher as you were doing that exploration.
Well, as I mentioned, John Bradshaw, who was talking a lot about addiction recovery, individuation, and things like that. Wayne Dwyer, who was on PBS a lot. I followed a guy. I wrote about him in the book. I don't remember, but he is the World Harvest Church in Columbus, Ohio, and he was dramatic. I mean, he would get his microphone and he would go, "We need to follow the Lord," and he would really emote everything in there. I watched comedians. I watched Jerry Seinfeld and people like him. How does he talk to a crowd? There were particular people. You have to remember, this is back in cable where nothing's being recorded, so I had to just happen upon it. I would watch people like Benny Hinn. I find Benny Hinn to be, some of you may love him, I just find him to be kind of weird. But, what I was always watching for is, what's their connection with the crowd? Are people leaning in or leaning out? That my content was never what their content was. But the structure, I would just pay attention. If I was doing it now, I'd be studying TED Talks. 18-minute talks that really get a point across, that people walk away and think, I'm a little bit different now because of watching those things. But I'd be studying, and I write about TED Talks and what why they're so popular, but what's the platform? What's the structure of a typical TED Talk? Because that can really inform how we do our preaching.
Well, I remember when I was a seminarian in Berkeley in the 1970s, so this will date me and put me in a particular context. But from the window of my apartment, I could see a building in downtown Berkeley that somebody had climbed up on it and had, with spray paint, had graffitied, in contrast to Rene Descartes, "I feel, therefore I am.
Mm-hmm.
I think, therefore I am." And that's always been a touchstone for me ever since, about understanding of the cultural changes that were already going on in Berkeley in the 1970s and have now sort of started to sweep across the country. So talk a little bit about how the importance of dealing with feeling and experience in the preaching moment.
Yeah, and I think that's a huge thing, and this has been something I've been writing about really since I published Becoming a Blessed Church in 2005, and it's really kind of found its way into every book. I think that quite often we just don't pay attention to what people are experiencing, not only in our sermons, but what people are experiencing in church. And I look at this as also as a therapist, as a spiritual director, as a coach. Could you imagine going to a therapist who says your emotions don't matter? All that really matters is that you're here talking with me, but your focus needs to be on my wisdom. You wouldn't keep a client for very long. That really good therapy, group therapy, family therapy, you explore their emotions, you explore their perceptions, you explore what's going on, which also includes, as a therapist, what's going on in the session here. Are they experiencing something that's helping them, or are we just not hitting on the same wavelength? I heard a sermon this past weekend where the preacher was talking about how, it's tragic that in the mainline church we're paying so much attention to people's experiences, that really when it comes to worship, the focus should be on God. Well, but then we turn around and talk about the relationship with God. So it's kind of like, okay, which is it? Do we have a relationship with God, which is both people are involved in it? Or is it the relationship just us sitting at God's feet, focusing on God? And I really believe that that healthy relationships are two-parted. And that includes, the I-thou relationship with God. So I think in our, not just our preaching, but our worship, we have to be asking, what are people experiencing in worship? What are they experiencing with my sermons? Am I speaking to their experiences, or am I just hitting intellectually? And I think that's one of the problems with modern preaching, is we do not take into account body, mind, and spirit. We don't take account thinking and emoting. We don't take into account the struggles that people are having, and how we engage the struggles. I will also add, the non-denominational evangelicals do pay attention to that. And it is a reason why I don't always agree with what they say. Like if you're doing a sermon on marriage, I don't agree that the problem is women just need to be more submissive to their husbands. By the way, I did ask the question one time in a sermon, how many of you feel that that your wife is submissive to you? And afterwards, one of the guys said, well, I was going to raise my hand, but my wife wouldn't let me. But at any rate, you sort of, I think sermons should be experiential, where there's a back and forth. And as I said, this one sermon I heard this past week really disassociated the experience. And I really think we need to be talking about people's experiences, but we need to also look at how we preach. If we're preaching in a dull monotone, looking down at our paper and just talking intellectually, people are having an experience of that. What is their experience? Quite frankly, if I sit here and read to you, you're not going to pay attention to me. But if I'm talking in a way that feels dialogical, that makes a difference, and it makes a connection.
Well, and when I introduced you, I failed to say, Graham, that you're a PCUSA pastor.
I am a PCUSA pastor, yeah.
Part of the Reformed tradition. And I grew up in the Southern Baptist tradition, but became a Presbyterian during my college years for a whole host of reasons that we don't need to go into today. But my quest has always been, how do we connect the head and the heart?
Yes.
In the preaching moment? There are some traditions that really go for the heart. There's some that really go for the head. But and you said yes. So why is it important for us to appeal to maybe both head and heart, to connect those two centers?
Because that's where people are. People aren't just heads. And by denying the heart, well, actually, I'll take a step back even further. One of the things I've learned as a therapist, spiritual director, coach, I was a therapist before I became a pastor. We like to think, in the Reformed tradition especially, that if we say something intellectually, that will change their lives. The reality is most people are more emotion than they are thought. Cognitive behavioral therapy really focuses not just on changing your thinking, but changing your emotions to particular thoughts. There's a recognition that when we have a thought, that thought can give rise to an emotion. And then we can even have an emotion about the emotion. Human beings live in the emotional world much more than they live in the intellectual world. Your amygdala tends to be stronger than your prefrontal cortex. And I can tell you, the way you can tell is a lot of you are already having feelings about what I'm saying.
That's good, isn't it? Right? That's good. Yeah, we're already.
Yes. So paying attention to where people's feelings are and what they're grappling with in their hearts, that matters. And preaching that just is intellectual, I've often heard people say, I preached about that and they're still not doing it. It's like, well, you know what? I've preached to my kids a million times about things and they still don't do it. But it's often not until I kind of sit down with them and go, well, why are you having such a struggle with this? And they share their emotions, that's where the change really begins to happen.
When Deborah put a question up in the chat, but I'm going to back it up to a conversation we will often have, especially when we're talking with seminary faculty. We'll say to them, so how much of your seminary's budget goes toward 1 day a week? And how much of your seminary's budget really goes toward 1 hour on that
hour a week?
Yeah. And how much of it really goes towards the 15 to 40 minutes in that 1 hour in a week? And so
I'll add something else to that, Jim.
Okay.
Which is, and how many of you professors have actually done this stuff on a regular basis? Because most of our seminaries don't have professors who've actually pastored church as well.
I remember talking with Scott Black Johnson, the pastor at Fifth Avenue Presbyterian, New York, who used to be the homiletics professor at Austin Seminary. And he said to me, there came a time in my tenure at Austin that I said to myself, I've got to figure out if I can really go out and do what I've been teaching all these years.
But I interrupted your question, so sorry about that, Jim.
No. That's quite all right. This is a conversation.
Yeah.
So she was asking, can you imagine a time when, let me add one thing to it before I ask her a question, and that is, I will often ask people, in what other context do people listen to a talking head for 20 minutes, 30 minutes? Outside of church? And the answer is really not very many, unless it's a really interesting webinar like this one. But we're really talking heads going here. So she says, can you imagine a time when the sermon won't be such a central part of the worship experience going forward?
Well, that's a hard question to answer. Predicting the future is always difficult. So, Deborah, if it's okay if I kind of veer my answer off into a little bit of a different direction. I think in some cases that's already happening. The sermon is the part where people tune out. So whether there is a sermon or not a sermon, people will tune into the music, they'll turn into the aesthetics, they'll tune into the community, but often they will tune out the sermon. And because they tune out the sermon, they're not really getting it. And I think, so maybe I would answer it a different way. People are already doing it. I found myself as a pastor, I try not to, but I do it periodically. I'll visit a church where the sermon is just really not engaging. I have to struggle not to pull out my phone and just do something else. So I think that so now let me veer into another way of answering this. And somebody has their, maybe it's mine, maybe it's yours, because I'm getting feedback on my end. But I think what's happened is we have moved in our culture from a wordy culture to a more musical and experiential culture. By and large, in the realm of TikTok now, 2 minutes is the length of which everything is. We're moving away from wordiness. If you look at most of our Protestant worship services, they are filled with words. You look at a typical bulletin, it's word after word after word after word in a culture that's becoming less wordy. If you look at most non-denominational worship services, it's very musical, not very wordy. So I think an essential way of thinking about this, which is the way we looked at it as Calvin Church, the sermon is only part of the whole worship experience. It is not the center of it. It is only part of it. And so what we need to do is to try to find a way to make all parts engaging, and that includes the sermon. And I think that's another way of approaching it, is we have to be asking the question, what's the best way to teach people things they need to know that engages them, but makes it part of the overall experience? And this goes back to your question of head and heart. If the worship service is done really well, they've been engaged in head and heart and body and soul and every other way. It's not quite answering it directly, but it's trying to bring in a lot more elements. I think the main thing, if I was going to say anything, I think modern Protestant worship is way too wordy. We do not, and so one of the things we did at Calvin Church when I first stopped there was we started integrating a lot more music, not necessarily contemporary hymns, but just little pieces that we even sung all throughout the service. And we actually diminished the amount of words and we created more open space. So for a good example, we got rid of the responsive call to worship. And I'll explain why. If I were to say in a church, we come here to worship Christ, everybody goes, yes, we gather in joy to worship Christ. Well, that's not much of an experience. And so we changed that. We started out with the Taizé chant and then had 30 seconds of silent prayer, and then had either myself or our associate pastor say a prayer of blessing. It changed the whole beginning because it created more of a spiritual experience rather than a robotic experience. And it got us out of that wordiness. So anyway, I think I've at least tried to answer the question well.
Yes, well, and you have answered it well. I was just thinking about, as we talk about all the folks that have been worshiping with us remotely and during the period of COVID, and wondering if and when they will ever come back. One of the things that I notice in talking with people is that they will say, I kind of like being in my pajamas and having my latte and turning off the sound if I don't like the sermon.
Mm-hmm.
That's the one time they say, that's the one time, if I'm going to opt out anywhere along the course of this worship service, it's going to be during the sermon, which makes me wonder, well, will they ever come back, because they have to sit through the sermon if they're in the sanctuary with us in person?
They come back when the experience of church is better than sitting at home.
So
I'll actually, Jim, I'm going to share a really weird story.
I love stories.
I have a kind of a side interest that I've been interested in since I was 17 years old. And it does click into my counseling and spiritual direction background. I've been fascinated with people who've had near-death experiences, but also spiritual experiences that can't be explained. There is a United Church of Christ pastor named Howard Storm who wrote a book called My Descent into Death. And he was an aggressive atheist, ended up getting a perforated stomach when he was in France. He was an art professor at Northern Kentucky University. And he ended up getting a perforated stomach just through some kind of an ulcer. It just blew out while he was in the hotel room. Ended up going to the hospital. They couldn't find a surgeon. He lingered for 10 hours. And he doesn't know whether he actually died or something else happened, because there was no one even really kind of take his vitals, but something happened. And he had a profound experience that afterwards led him to eventually start going to church and to eventually go to seminary and become a UCC pastor in Cincinnati and then Dayton. And then he retired, and now he's part-time in a small church in Northern Kentucky. And he said that when he begged his wife, who was an aggressive atheist also, after his experience, to take him to church. And she did, reluctantly. And he said, I walked in and I literally saw angels in the church. And he said, I fell down on the ground before them. And he said, they had to pull me back up. And my wife yelled at me and said, if you ever do that again, I will never take you to church again, which is a weird thought. And she actually eventually divorced him because he went to seminary and became involved in the church. But he said what he noticed in the worship service. Now, again, I'm just sharing what he wrote. I am not telling you how true it is or not. But he said in that worship service, he noticed when people were praying, when the music was going on, all of that stuff, that the angels came closer into the congregation. And during the sermon, they went up to the ceiling. So I don't know what that means, but it's an interesting commentary.
Absolutely. Well, as I'm listening to you, Graham, I'm hearing a couple of shifts that you're suggesting to us, kind of within what you're saying. And one is sort of a shift from a passive worship experience to an active one. I was thinking of cards saying, no, we're all the actors and God is the audience. Whereas in most of our churches, it's the folks up front who are the actors and the congregation is the audience. So moving from passive to active, from moving from kind of only the sense of hearing, listening as the only sense being engaged in the worshiper, to a multi-sensory experience, and a greater participatory experience in worship. Would it be fair to say that those are directions you'd love to see us all move in?
Yeah, we started, we started doing projection in our service in 2003. We actually started doing live streaming in 2010. We bought the camera and stuff in 2008, and it took us 2 years to figure out how to install it and what to do with it. I will say, I felt, I'm no longer at my church, and I wasn't there during the pandemic, but I was really excited that my successor, David Paul, was able to come in and take the live streaming we'd already done, and they added 4 cameras and did mixes, and they did a green screen room. They really jumped into it, where he really jumped in and said, hey, even if we're online, we've got to make this experiential. Okay, that's a commentary. When we first started doing projection, it wasn't to project. It was not to project hymn, song lyrics. We actually weren't all that interested. It was so when I preached, I could show pictures. If I'm talking about something going on in the Bible in the Middle East, I can show a map. We could show film clips, or even I could put up scripture. If I'm going to do kind of an explication of things, I can put up scripture, I can put up points, but it was to get people more engaged in the sermon. And I'll give you an example of this, of something I did. And it was one of my favorite sermons. So I talked about predestination. Good Presbyterian, you're supposed to talk about predestination, even though we ignore it. And what I said was, most people misunderstand predestination. And I told a story of a group of people who asked me, who worked with my wife, who wanted to talk to me about what predestination was. And I said to them, predestination is not the same as predetermination. Predetermination is we're puppets, God's a puppet master. Predestination only has to do with our final ultimate destination. And what predestination means is that God's in charge of where we go, and it's up to God. It's just our destination, but God doesn't tell us how we have to live on the way to that destination. And so I had a laser pointer and I put up a map of Western Pennsylvania, and I said, 2 weekends ago, I gave a talk in Oleans, New York. Now, that was my destination. I had a choice of how I go there. And I showed my laser pointer. The best way to go is to go up Route 79 and then 90 and then hit Route 17 and then go down 215 or something like that to Olean, New York. And I said, that's the quickest way. All I know is my destination, but I can choose how I'm going to get there. And then I said, or I could have chosen the other route, which is, and I showed them, I said, I drive up to Butler, PA, I pick up Route 8 and I go Route 8 through Franklin, and it's going to take me an hour longer, but it's really scenic. Or if I really don't like the routes that God set for me, I could actually get in a car and drive to Chicago and then get on a train in Chicago and take it all the way to San Francisco. In San Francisco, I can pick up a plane and take it to Shanghai or to, Beijing or something. And from there, I can get on a hypersonic train and take it out into the middle of the desert, where I get into a caravan and take the caravan into the Middle East, where maybe I spend a month in prison. And then after that, I can finally get somebody to take me to the border, where I pick up a plane that takes me to London, and then I take a boat to New York, and I rent a car in New York and drive to Ole in New York. And I said, predestination is not God saying how, what we have to do to live there. All it's saying is God is determining what the destination. And I used a laser pointer when I was doing that. Well, what I did by doing that was I engaged them into an experience where I'm talking about predestination, not from an intellectual part, but I'm actually getting them involved with their mind, their emotions, their imagination, their visual sight. I'm really trying to engage them in all that. You can all disagree with my interpretation of predestination, but it was a lot more fun for me, and for them, it was a lot more fun for them because they were leaning into it.
Well, earlier you said, because I'm aware we're getting close to the end of our time together. Earlier on, you basically said you would encourage us all to become mystery shoppers and go listen to people who are engaging people by the way they talk, and and to learn from them how they do that, not the content of it, but how they're doing that. What are 3 or 4 other kind of practical things you wish pastors would begin to do in order to more effectively reach those who are right at that edge of the church door, either looking in or with one foot out?
Okay, so I'll try to make these simple, but you're asking me to do 3 out of like 15 things. One thing is, I think, preaching to the whole brain, and let me explain that. Most people don't understand brain structure, or our right brains are they're not only abstract, they're really into metaphor. They're really into symbol, but they're also really into story. They're really into art. It's the right brain is the big picture brain. It understands things at a macro level. The left brain, by and large, tends to be detailed. It's not just language, but how many of you here are right-handed? Those of you who are right-handed, did you know that your left brain controls your right hand? And the reason why, it controls the right hand, you're right-handed because that's the detail hand. That's the one that can write small things and draw small things and do screws and twist them and things like that. This side of your brain tends to be concrete. It tends to be detail. It tends not to care about the abstract. And quite frankly, I'm assuming most of you are preachers. Have you ever run into that problem when you're writing your sermon and you have this great idea and you can't figure out how to say it? Has anybody had that experience? And where you get frustrated, and that's your left brain basically saying, I don't want to do this. I don't want to figure out this stuff in language. Let's just say anything and let's just move on and do something else. The left brain tends to be very impatient. As a result, it's much easier for us to talk about things abstractly and intellectually. And when I do work with pastors on changing their preaching, what I often do is say, the hardest part of a sermon is to get into the details. Don't just talk to them about you need to be out there changing the world, but dig into them. What's causing them to resist caring about African Americans? What gets them to resist focusing on God? Get into the details. I often say Presbyterians are really good at exploring the problem. We're just not very good at offering concrete solutions. I think good preaching not only is something abstract, but it pays attention to the details where people are struggling and tries to offer them guidance. Again, I don't like a lot of non-denominational preaching, but they often will do 5 ways to a better marriage, 3 ways to better, more ethical business. They're very good at talking about the details. We tend to be much better at just talking abstract. So what we'll do is we'll say, we will say something like, you all need to be radically hospitable. Well, as a mission at Calvin Church, we worked to turn around a church that had 4 years prior to us coming on board to help them had gone from 200 members down to 17. And we were tasked with turning them around, which we did. We didn't just talk about how they need to be more hospitable to visitors, but I turned a sermon into a training session on the details of how do you go up to someone you don't know, talk to them, welcome them, make them feel at home. We did the details of how do you be welcoming instead of just talking about it. So that's one thing, is to talk about the details. I think a second thing is, and this is much harder to communicate, start gravitating away from theological sermons and move more into spiritual sermons. And I don't mean spiritual sermons where you're teaching them how to do contemplative prayer or engage in a practice. That's functionalizing spirituality. Spirituality is all about not only the relationship we have with God, but all the struggles, the obstacles that come in the way that cause us to struggle and turn away from God. Talk to where people are struggling. Focus in on where people are struggling. And the way you find out how to talk to them is by engaging in understanding your own struggles and using them as a template for reaching out to other people. I think the third thing is move your sermons away from being an explication of what the biblical passage says and move them towards how do I help people transform their lives? Which means you have to talk about the struggle to go from here to there. Most preaching says, you need to get to here. You're all here, you need to get to here. I think the engaging preaching talks about that struggle of how to migrate from here to there. So those are kind of my three things, and I don't even remember what my first thing was. Preaching to the whole brain, focus on details and not the other thing. The last thing was engage in the struggle. And I think the middle one was, the last thing was to engage in the spiritual struggle. And I think the middle thing, you all heard me, so you'll remember it better than I do.
Yeah, to get the other 13, you need to get a copy of Graham's book.
Yeah, because really, this book, by the way, purposely, it does not integrate typical homiletics. It brings in things from, I talk about how to preach in a postmodern age when we've been trained in modernist preaching. How do we preach in a way that's transforming? How do we preach to millennials and Generation Z when they're looking for something different? How do we preach across multiple intelligences? And how do you integrate modern communications theory into our preaching where we tend to ignore it? So it is intentionally trying to bring in things that we don't pay attention to and to integrate other insights.
Graham, I want to thank you. This has been a really wonderful conversation. Just watching the chat, it's really engaged people in reflecting on their own preaching and the art of preaching. And so I really appreciate your sharing this time with us this morning. I want to talk a little bit about next week in this series. We're going to have Dustin, is it Banak or Benak, Matt?
Benak.
He teaches at Truett Seminary and at Baylor University and is the co-founder of their co-founder and director of its program for the Future Church. And he's going to be talking about his literally hot off the press book, Adaptive Church, Collaboration and Community in a Changing World. So another way of thinking about ways we need to experiment about what is going to be, how the church is going to need to be different into the future. So Graham, you have kicked off this series wonderfully, and we really appreciate your time and energy.
Oh, listen, I am so grateful for all of your time. I will say one of the things as I've gotten older, I've had less energy to promote my book. So Jim, having someone help me in this is such a blessing.
All right. Glad to do it, Graham. Thank you all for joining us today. Hope you have a great weekend.
Thank you.